In olden times, a Spider-Man lived in the sky country. He lived in a bright little house all by himself where he weaved webs and long, flimsy ladders by which people went back and forth from the sky to the earth. The star people often went down to earth at night where they roamed about as fairies of light doing good deeds for women and little children. And they always went back and forth on the ladder of the Spider-Man. The Spider-Man had to work very hard weaving his webs and spinning the silk from which his ladders were made. One day he finally got a short break from his work. He looked down at the earth country and saw many of the earth people playing games or taking sweet sap from the maple trees or gathering berries on the rolling hills. But most of the men were sitting around doing nothing. The women were all working, which was the way of the First Nations peoples of those days. The men were working very little, and Spider-Man said to himself, I should go to the earth country. The men just sit around all day, and I would marry 4 wives who would work for me while I would take life easy because I need a rest. The Spider-Man was very tired because the star people made him work day and night, always spinning and weaving his webs. But when he asked for a rest, they said, You cannot stop. We need to use your ladders. You sleepyhead lazy bones, work harder. The Spider-Man grew angry. He thought if he made himself a nuisance, they would be glad to be rid of him. So he devised a plan. Each night when a star fairy was climbing back to the sky country and got close to the top of the ladder, the Spider-Man would cut the strands of web and the fairy would fall to earth with a great crash. Night after night, he would do this, watching the sky fairies sprawling through the air as they fell while the earth people looked up wonderingly at them, calling them shooting stars. Many of the star people who fell couldn't get back to the sky country because they had broken their arms and legs and couldn't climb back up the web ladders. But the Spider-Man's plan didn't work. The star people needed his webs and kept him laboring night and day. Finally, the Spider-Man decided to run away. So one night when moon and stars had gone to work and sun was asleep, he said farewell to the sky country and let himself down to earth by one of his own strands, spinning it as he dropped down. In the earth country, he married 4 wives as he had planned, because he wanted them to work for him as he lazed around. He thought he had worked long and hard enough, and all went well for a while, and the Spider-Man was very happy living his lazy and contented life. Not a single strand did he spin, not a single web did he weave. No men on earth were working. Only the women worked. Finally, Glooskap, who ruled the earth at that time, became very angry at the men because they were so lazy. I will send famine into their country to punish them for their laziness. Well, famine came stealthily into the land and gathered up all the corn and carried it off. Then Glooskap called all the animals and the birds and the fish to him, leaving the people with nothing left to eat. Only water remained. The people were very hungry. The Spider-Man soon grew tired of this water diet. It filled his belly and swelled him to a great size, but didn't give him nourishment or strength. There must be food somewhere on the earth. I'll go and search for it. That night, when the world was asleep, he took a large bag and crept softly away. For several days he traveled, living only on water, but he found no food, and the bag remained empty on his back. At last, he saw birds in the trees, and he knew that he was near the border of the Hunger Land. That night, when he stopped at a stream to drink, he saw a gleam of light far ahead through the trees. He hurried towards the light, and soon he came upon a man with a great hump on his shoulders and scars on his face, and a light hanging at his back with a shade on it, which he could open and close at will. I'm looking for food. Tell me where I can find it. Do you want it for your people? No, I want it for myself. You're near the border of the land of plenty. Follow me, and I will give you food. Then the man flashed the light at his back, opening and closing the shade so that the light flickered, and he set off quickly through the trees. The Spider-Man followed the light, and when he reached the house where the humped man had stopped, The hunt man gave him a good fat meal, and the Spider-Man soon felt better after his long fast. You are the Spider-Man who once weaved webs in the sky. I too once dwelt in the star country, and one dark night as I was climbing back from the earth country on your ladder, carrying my lamp on my back to light the way. When I was near the sky, you cut the strands of web and I fell to the earth with a great crash. That is why I have a great hump on my back and broken arms and legs. And because of this, I could never go back to the sky country. I roam the earth at night as a forest fairy, just as I did in the olden days, because my former power is still with me, and I still carry my lamp at my back. It is the starlight from the sky country. Although you were cruel to me, I will give you food. The Spider-Man remembered the nights he had cut the ladder strands, and he laughed to himself at the memory of the star fairies falling to earth with a great crash. But the man with the light knew that now he had his chance to take vengeance on the Spider-Man, who did not suspect any evil. I will give you 4 pots. You must not open them until you get home. They will then be filled with food, and thereafter always when you open them, they will be packed with good food, and the food will never grow less. The Spider-Man put the 4 pots in his bag, and slinging it over his shoulder, he set out for his home, pleased with his success. For several days he traveled without opening the pots. Although he was almost starving, he wished to do as the hunt man had told him. At last he could wait no longer. He stopped near his home, took the pots out of the bag, and opened them. In one was a fine meat stew, in another were many cooked vegetables, in another was bread made from Indian corn, and in another was luscious ripe fruit. He ate until he was full. He covered the pots, put them back in the bag, and hid the bag among the trees. Then he went home. He had meanwhile taken pity on his people, and he invited the chief and all the tribe to feast the next evening, for the pots would be full and the food would never decrease, and there would be enough for everyone. He thought the people would regard him as a very wonderful man if he could supply them all with good food. The next night the people gathered for the feast, for the news of it had spread throughout the land. They had taken no water that day, for they wished to eat well, and they were very hungry. The Spider-Man was very glad because the people praised him, and he proudly brought in his bag of pots. The people all waited hungrily, but when he uncovered the first pot, there was no food. He uncovered the second pot, but there was no food there. He uncovered all the pots, but not a bit of food was in any of them. They were all empty, and in the bottom of each was a great gaping hole. And this is what happened. When the humped man had given the pots to the Spider-Man, he knew well that the Spider-Man would disobey his orders, and that he would open the pots before he reached his home. He chuckled to himself because now he could take vengeance on the web weaver who had injured him. So when the Spider-Man had left the pots among the trees, the humped man used his magic power and made holes in the pots, and the charm of the food was broken, and all the food disappeared. When the people saw the empty pots, they thought they had been purposely deceived. The remains of the food and the smell of stew and of fruit still clung to the pots. They thought the Spider-Man had eaten all the food himself. So in their great hunger, rage, and disappointment, they fell upon him and beat him, while the humped man hiding behind the trees looked on and laughed. Then the people split the Spider-Man's arms to the shoulders and his legs to the thighs. So now he had 8 limbs instead of 4. And the humped man, the star fairy, named Firefly, came forth from behind the trees, and standing over the falling Spider-Man, he said, "Henceforth, because of your cruelty to the star people, you will always crawl on 8 legs, and you will have a fat round belly because of the water you have drunk, and you shall eat only flies and insects. You will always spin downwards, but never upwards. And you will often try to get back to the star country, but you shall always slip down again on the strand of yarn you have spun." Then Firefly flashed his light and went quickly away, opening and closing the shade of his lamp as he flitted among the trees. And to this day, the Spider-Man lives as Firefly had spoken, because of the cruelty he practiced on the star fairies in the olden times. Thank you.